You're about to steal a dead man's fortune. The words sliced through the silence so cleanly that for a moment, nobody in the room seemed to breathe. Every eye turned toward the speaker, not toward a senior banker, not toward a lawyer, not toward one of the men whose tailored suits cost more than most families earned in a month. The voice had come from the doorway, from the Watchman. Owen Whitmore stood beside the massive walnut doors of Beaumont Private Bank, his navy uniform pressed neatly, his silver hair catching the glow of crystal chandeliers suspended above the executive conference room. At 63 years old, Owen had spent nearly 2 decades opening doors for people whose names appeared in financial magazines and international headlines. Most of them never remembered his face. Today, every person in the room stared at him. At the far end of the polished table, a digital authorization screen glowed softly. One touch. That was all it would take. One touch, and $100 million would leave the estate of Count Alexander Beaumont forever. The transfer had already passed legal review. Compliance had approved it. Private advisors had signed off on it. The paperwork lay neatly arranged on the table like sacred scripture. Everything was ready. Everything except Owen Whitmore. The chief executive blinked in disbelief. His hand remained frozen inches above the confirmation tablet. "What did you just say?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Zurich shimmered beneath a gray winter sky. Snow dusted the rooftops along the river. Inside the bank, warmth radiated from marble floors and golden lamps imported from Florence decades earlier. The room smelled faintly of leather, polished wood, and expensive coffee. It was the kind of room where fortunes moved without emotion. Yet emotion was exactly what filled it now. Owen felt every heartbeat in his chest. Every instinct told him to stay silent. Men like him did not interrupt meetings like this. Men like him opened doors, nodded politely, and disappeared into the background. But something inside him refused to let the transfer happen. Across the table sat Victor Hale, the estate attorney overseeing the transaction. He adjusted his cufflinks and smiled the way powerful people smiled when they believed a problem would soon vanish. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice smooth as glass, "I think you may be confused." A few nervous chuckles followed. Owen didn't smile. His blue eyes remained fixed on a single page near the center of the table. The transfer authorization. The Count's signature. One signature. One tiny detail. One missing mark. The room saw ink. Owen saw something else. He saw 40 years of memory. He saw stacks of handwritten envelopes. He saw an old mail handler with weathered hands and impossible attention to detail. Most importantly, he saw a mistake. A mistake worth $100 million. The chief executive slowly lowered his hand from the tablet. The laughter faded. Nobody understood why the Watchman looked so certain. Nobody understood why his face had gone pale. Nobody understood how a man who spent his days holding doors could possibly challenge the combined judgment of bankers, attorneys, and financial experts. But they were about to find out. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The silence inside the conference room felt heavier than the snow clouds hanging above Zurich. The executives exchanged uncertain glances. A compliance officer lowered her pen. An assistant stopped typing. Even the quiet hum of the ventilation system seemed suddenly louder. Owen Whitmore stood near the doorway exactly where he had stood every morning for the last 18 years. Yet somehow the room looked at him differently now. Not as part of the furniture. Not as the man who greeted clients with a polite nod. They looked at him as if he had stepped into a role he had no right to occupy. Victor Hale leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. His expression remained calm, but a faint shadow crossed his eyes. "This transfer has been reviewed by 3 independent departments," he said. "The documentation is complete. The estate trustees have approved it. The signature has been authenticated." He spoke slowly, confidently, like a man reciting facts carved into stone. Several heads nodded around the table. The chief executive turned toward Owen. "Then explain why you stopped us." Owen swallowed. He was not accustomed to speaking in rooms like this. He had spent most of his life listening, watching, remaining unnoticed. But years of standing quietly in hallways had taught him something valuable. People often revealed the truth when they believed nobody important was paying attention. His eyes drifted back to the authorization form resting beneath the chandelier light. The Count's signature flowed elegantly across the page. Every letter appeared perfect. Every stroke appeared deliberate. To everyone else, it looked genuine. Because it is wrong, Owen said softly. Victor smiled. And you became a handwriting expert when exactly? A few people laughed. The sound was uncomfortable, forced. Owen ignored it. He took a careful step closer to the table. I am not an expert, he admitted. But I knew Count Beaumont. The room grew quiet again. Count Alexander Beaumont had been one of the bank's most respected clients. For more than 30 years he had walked through these doors carrying himself with old-world grace. Wealth followed him everywhere, yet he treated employees with a kindness many richer men never learned. Owen remembered the Count stopping to ask about his daughter's college graduation. He remembered Christmas cards signed personally instead of by assistants. He remembered conversations that lasted only minutes but felt sincere. Lots of people knew him, Victor replied. That proves nothing. Owen nodded slowly. You are right. But I also knew someone else. A strange expression crossed his face. Not fear. Not confidence. Something closer to memory. Walter Finch. Several executives looked puzzled. The name meant nothing to them. Victor frowned. Who? The mail handler, Owen answered. He worked here before I did. The room remained silent. Owen could almost see Walter standing beside him again. Thin gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, ink stains on his fingers. A man who spent 40 years sorting private correspondence for some of the wealthiest families in Europe. A man who noticed details others ignored. And years ago, Walter had shared a secret about the Count that nobody in this room seemed to know. The mention of Walter Finch landed softly, yet it seemed to echo through the conference room. Nobody around the table reacted with recognition except Owen. To the executives, Walter had been the sort of employee history quietly forgets. He had never managed a department. He had never signed a major contract. His name had never appeared in an annual report. Yet for more than 40 years, Walter had occupied a small office deep inside the bank, sorting private correspondence that arrived from royal families, industrial dynasties, diplomats, and old European estates. He understood something most people did not. Wealth left fingerprints, not just on documents, but on habits. The chief executive leaned forward. What does a retired mail handler have to do with this transfer? Owen glanced toward the snow-covered skyline beyond the windows. The answer carried him back many years. Back to mornings when he was new at the bank, still learning the rhythms of the building. Walter had been nearing retirement then. Every day he arrived precisely at 7:15. Every day he carried the same brown leather satchel. Every day he treated handwritten letters with the respect of museum artifacts. He believed that a person's character lived inside the smallest details. One winter afternoon, during a quiet shift, Walter had shown Owen a stack of old envelopes from Count Alexander Beaumont. The Count still preferred handwritten correspondence long after most wealthy clients had switched to digital communication. Walter admired that. He admired the discipline, the consistency, the humanity. Look closely, Walter had said while adjusting his glasses. Owen remembered laughing at the time. To him, every signature looked exactly the same. Elegant, expensive, impossible to read. But Walter had pointed toward the final letter in the Count's last name. There, at the very end, sat a tiny loop no larger than a grain of rice. It was easy to miss. Most people never noticed it. Yet it appeared every single time. Hundreds of letters. Decades of correspondence. Always the same. Owen remembered asking why it mattered. Walter had smiled. Because people repeat what their hearts remember. Then he shared a story he had heard directly from the Count years earlier. The small loop was not required. It had no legal significance. It existed for one reason alone. The Count's late wife had once teased him about ending his signature too abruptly. After she passed away, he kept adding the loop. A private tradition. A quiet remembrance. Something only a handful of people ever knew. Back in the conference room, Owen could feel the attention shifting. The laughter was gone now. Several executives exchanged uncertain looks. Victor Hale remained motionless, but his smile had faded. That is a touching story, Victor said finally. Unfortunately, sentimental memories are not evidence. Owen nodded. No, he agreed. But habits repeated for 40 years are not sentiment. They are patterns. His eyes settled once more on the authorization form. The signature resting on the page appeared flawless. The handwriting matched. The pressure matched. The style matched. Everything matched except one thing. The tiny loop was gone. The conference room remained perfectly still. Outside, snow drifted past the towering windows in slow white spirals, softening the sharp outlines of Zurich's skyline. Inside, however, the atmosphere had changed. The certainty that had filled the room only minutes earlier was beginning to crack. The transfer authorization still rested on the polished table beneath the warm glow of imported Italian lamps. Yet now it seemed less like a routine document and more like a question nobody could answer. Victor Hale adjusted his tie and exhaled slowly. He was a man accustomed to control. For years he had managed estates, negotiated acquisitions, and guided fortunes through legal mazes that confused everyone else. He understood how power worked. Power lived in credentials, titles, and signatures. It certainly did not live in the observations of a watchman. "We are discussing a $100 million transaction," Victor said carefully. "Not a family memory." Several executives nodded, grateful for the return of logic. The chief executive looked between the attorney and Owen, weighing both men. One represented expertise. The other represented doubt. Banks were built on certainty. Doubt was expensive. Owen understood exactly what they were thinking. He could almost hear it. What if he was wrong? What if a lifetime of quiet observations had finally led him to an embarrassing mistake? The possibility sat heavily in his chest. Yet another thought sat there too. What if he was right? He looked down at his weathered hands. They were not the hands of a banker. They had opened doors through rainstorms and snowstorms. They had carried packages for elderly clients. They had helped visitors who were lost inside the sprawling marble building. Ordinary hands. Invisible hands. But those same hands had spent 18 years holding thousands of envelopes addressed to Count Alexander Beaumont. They had seen his correspondence arrive from London, Geneva, Paris, and Vienna. They had witnessed patterns no software would ever notice. Across the room, a young compliance officer quietly opened a digital archive on her tablet. Curiosity had replaced skepticism. If the story was false, proving it would take only seconds. If it was true, the implications were enormous. The chief executive noticed her searching and said nothing. He was curious too. Victor noticed and frowned. The room was slipping beyond his control. "Surely we are not delaying a major transfer because of a missing flourish," he said. His voice remained calm, but now there was tension beneath it. Owen met his gaze. "Not because of a missing flourish," he replied softly. "Because of what its absence means." Nobody answered. The words settled over the room like fresh snowfall. Then the compliance officer suddenly stopped scrolling. Her eyes narrowed. She enlarged an image on her screen. Then another. Then another. One by one, historical documents filled the display. Letters. Instructions. Estate records. Decades of correspondence. Every signature belonged to the Count. And every single one ended the same way. With a tiny loop. The compliance officer slowly turned her tablet toward the center of the table. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The evidence was sitting there in plain sight. One document after another filled the screen. Letters written from country estates in England. Personal instructions sent from Geneva. Charitable donations approved in Paris. Financial correspondence stretching back more than 20 years. Different dates. Different circumstances. Different pens. Yet every signature ended exactly the same way. The tiny loop appeared like a fingerprint left behind by habit and memory. The chief executive stood and walked around the table. He studied the images himself. The room that had once seemed so confident now felt uncertain. Glass walls reflected tense expressions. Coffee cups sat untouched. Outside, the snowfall continued, covering the city in quiet white layers while inside the bank a far more expensive storm was beginning to form. Victor Hale remained seated. His face revealed little, but his eyes never left the authorization form. "Interesting," he finally said. "But handwriting evolves. People change, especially in their later years." It sounded reasonable. Several executives looked relieved to hear an explanation. Yet Owen noticed something. Victor did not sound curious. He sounded prepared. The difference was small, but after years of watching people enter and leave the bank, Owen had learned to recognize it. Genuine surprise caused hesitation. Prepared explanations arrived too quickly. The chief executive looked toward the compliance officer. "How recent are those records?" She checked the archive. "The newest verified signature is from 14 months ago." A silence followed. 14 months was not yesterday, but it was not ancient history either. The Count had remained active until shortly before his health began to decline. Victor immediately seized the opening. "Exactly," he said. "The transfer authorization was signed much later." We are comparing different periods of his life. Owen felt doubt ripple through the room once more. Logic was returning to Victor's side. He understood that if uncertainty grew large enough, people would choose the safer path and proceed with the transfer. That was how institutions often worked. They trusted credentials over instincts, procedures over observations, titles over experience. Yet something continued to bother him. Not the missing loop. The missing loop had only been the beginning. There was another detail. Smaller. Stranger. A detail he had noticed the moment he first saw the authorization page. He hesitated. Speaking once had already placed him under a spotlight he never wanted. Speaking again could end his career if he was wrong. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Then he remembered Walter Finch. The old mail handler had once told him that patterns mattered because people rarely abandoned them without a reason. If one pattern disappeared, there was always another clue nearby. Owen slowly stepped toward the table. "There is something else," he said. Every eye turned toward him again. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. The chief executive folded his arms. "Go on." Owen pointed toward the signature. "The missing loop is not the only thing that does not belong there." The room seemed to lean closer. Even the snowfall beyond the windows felt distant now. Every person around the table watched Owen Whitmore as if seeing him for the first time. The watchman took a slow breath and looked down at the authorization form. His finger hovered just above the signature without touching the paper. "The Count always dated documents in the same way," he said quietly. Victor Hale immediately frowned. "That proves nothing." Owen did not respond. Instead, he looked toward the compliance officer. "Could you pull up any handwritten instruction from the Count during the last 10 years? The young woman hesitated only a moment before searching the archive. Seconds later, another document appeared on the large screen. Then another. Then another. The chief executive stepped closer. So did several board members. Owen pointed toward the date lines beneath each signature. "Read them." The compliance officer narrowed her eyes. March 5th, September 12th, January 21st. Owen nodded. "Now read the transfer authorization." She looked down. Her expression changed almost immediately. March 5. The room fell silent again. At first glance, the difference seemed meaningless. Yet Owen remembered Walter explaining it years ago while sorting correspondence in a basement office that smelled faintly of paper and ink. The Count never used numerical shorthand when writing by hand. Never. He believed dates should be written fully because important records deserve clarity. Walter had once joked that the Count wrote dates as though future historians would read them. The habit appeared on thousands of letters, decades of instructions, estate records, personal notes. Every single one followed the same pattern. Yet the authorization form did not. Victor crossed his arms. People change habits. The answer came too quickly, too smoothly. Owen noticed several executives noticing it as well. The chief executive slowly looked from the screen to the attorney. Did the Count ever stop using full dates? No one answered immediately. The compliance officer continued searching. More documents appeared. Different years, different countries, different circumstances. Every one of them showed the same format. Month written in full, day written in full. No exceptions. The growing collection of evidence seemed to shrink the room itself. Victor remained composed, but a thin line of tension appeared around his mouth. Owen felt his pulse quicken. The missing loop had been troubling. The date pattern was worse. Together, they formed something difficult to dismiss. Yet another thought continued to bother him. It had lingered in the back of his mind from the moment he first saw the paperwork. A memory. Small, fleeting, almost invisible. The kind of detail most people would never notice because they were looking at the signature instead of the page itself. Owen slowly picked up the authorization document. The paper felt expensive, heavy, perfectly chosen for a transaction involving enormous wealth. But as he held it beneath the chandelier light, something caught his eye. A tiny watermark embedded near the lower corner. His stomach tightened. He had seen that watermark before. Not years ago. Recently. Very recently. And it did not belong on a document the Count supposedly signed months earlier. Owen held the document carefully beneath the chandelier light. Around him, the executives waited in uneasy silence. The room had reached the point where nobody wanted to interrupt because every new observation seemed to uncover another layer of uncertainty. The watchman studied the watermark again. It was faint, nearly invisible unless the page was tilted at precisely the right angle. Most people would never have noticed it. Most people were not expected to. Yet Owen had spent years handling deliveries, internal memorandums, and secure banking correspondence. He knew paper the way a carpenter knew wood. Different textures, different weights, different origins. The compliance officer stepped closer. "What is it?" she asked. Owen pointed toward the lower corner. "This watermark." She leaned forward and narrowed her eyes. A moment later she saw it too. The chief executive moved beside her. Victor Hale remained seated, though his attention sharpened immediately. "What about it?" Victor asked. Owen did not answer right away. Instead, he searched his memory. 3 months earlier, the bank had changed paper suppliers for sensitive internal documentation. The previous manufacturer had closed a production facility, forcing a transition to a new security-grade stock. Employees had received a formal notice explaining the change. Most people ignored it. Owen remembered because one of the delivery managers had complained for an entire week about the packaging. The new watermark had been introduced at the same time. Subtle, elegant, difficult to counterfeit. He remembered it clearly because he had handled dozens of boxes carrying the new inventory. The compliance officer's expression shifted. "Wait." She immediately opened another database. Her fingers moved rapidly across the screen. The current watermark design was introduced 4 months ago. Nobody spoke. The words lingered in the room. For months ago, the transfer authorization supposedly carried a signature from nearly 8 months earlier. The chief executive looked at the document again, then at the compliance officer, then back at the document. "Are you certain?" he asked. She checked twice before answering. "Yes." The security paper did not exist when this document was supposedly signed. A cold silence settled over the conference room. Outside, snow continued drifting across the city, soft and peaceful. Inside, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Every discovery made the situation harder to explain away. First the missing loop, then the unusual date format. Now paper that had not even existed at the stated time. Individually, perhaps each detail could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern. Owen could feel it. So could everyone else. Victor finally stood from his chair. His movement was calm, but not relaxed. "There may be an administrative explanation," he said. "Documents are sometimes transferred onto updated stock during estate processing." The explanation sounded plausible. Yet nobody immediately agreed. The chief executive stared at the attorney for several long seconds. Something had changed. Earlier, Victor's confidence had guided the room. Now every answer seemed to arrive before the question had fully settled. The watchman noticed another thing as well. For the first time that afternoon, Victor stopped looking at the evidence and started looking toward the door. It was a brief glance, barely noticeable, but Owen had spent 18 years observing people who thought nobody was watching, and that single glance told him something important. Victor Hale was no longer worried about the document. He was worried about what might happen if someone started looking beyond it. The glance toward the door lasted less than a second, but Owen could not forget it. Over 18 years at the bank, he had learned that people revealed themselves most clearly during moments they believed nobody noticed. Wealthy clients displayed fear through silence. Executives revealed confidence through patience. And people hiding something often looked toward exits long before anyone mentioned leaving. Victor Hale quickly returned his attention to the room, but the damage had already been done. The chief executive had noticed it too. Several board members exchanged subtle looks. Doubt was spreading now, not because of a missing loop or an unusual date, but because confidence itself was beginning to crack. The conference room felt different. Earlier, everyone had assumed the transfer would be completed within minutes. Now nobody seemed eager to touch the authorization tablet. The compliance officer continued searching through internal records. Her fingers moved rapidly across the screen while page after page of documentation appeared before her. Every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. Owen remained near the table, feeling strangely out of place. He had never expected to stand at the center of a meeting like this. He was a watchman, a man whose responsibilities usually involved welcoming guests and ensuring the building remained secure. Yet security came in many forms. Sometimes it meant protecting a door. Sometimes it meant protecting a fortune. His thoughts drifted back to Walter Finch. The old mail handler had once shared another lesson during a late afternoon shift years ago. They had been sorting archived correspondence when Walter paused over a handwritten letter from the Count. "People spend too much time studying signatures," Walter had said. The smartest investigators study relationships. At the time, Owen had not understood what he meant. Walter explained that documents rarely existed alone. Every important paper connected to conversations, routines, assistants, schedules, and trusted people. A genuine document fit naturally into a larger story. A false one often stood by itself. The memory struck Owen with surprising force. He straightened slightly. "Who delivered this authorization?" he asked. The question interrupted the silence. The chief executive turned toward the compliance officer. "Can we verify the chain of custody?" She immediately opened another file. The room waited. Snow continued drifting beyond the windows, while digital records loaded one by one. Finally, her expression changed. "That is strange." Victor spoke before anyone else could. "What is strange?" The compliance officer looked up from her screen. "There is no courier record." The room froze. Every high-value document entering the bank generated a trail. Courier identification, arrival time, security confirmation, receipt signatures. The process existed specifically to prevent uncertainty. Yet according to the records, the authorization had appeared without the normal documentation. The chief executive frowned. "That is impossible." The compliance officer checked again. Then a third time. Her face grew pale. The document was delivered by hand. A heavy silence settled over the room. "By whom?" asked one of the board members. The compliance officer slowly looked at the screen. Then she looked toward Victor Hale. According to the intake record, it was submitted personally by the estate attorney. The words seemed to drain the warmth from the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The estate attorney remained standing beside the table, his expression carefully controlled. Yet for the first time that afternoon, he looked less like the man directing the meeting and more like a man trapped inside it. The chief executive slowly turned his attention toward him. "You delivered the document yourself?" Victor Hale nodded once. "Of course. That is hardly unusual. Sensitive estate matters often require personal handling." His answer sounded reasonable. It was the kind of answer that would have ended the discussion an hour earlier. But an hour earlier, nobody had known about the missing loop. Nobody had known about the date format. Nobody had known about the watermark. And nobody had known that the entire chain of custody began and ended with the same person. The compliance officer continued reviewing the intake records. "There is something else," she said quietly. Every head turned toward her. She swallowed before continuing. "The authorization was submitted on a Saturday." The chief executive frowned. "The bank was closed." "Exactly," she replied. Another silence followed. The private banking division occasionally processed extraordinary requests outside normal hours, but such exceptions required multiple approvals and extensive documentation. Yet the records showed none of those things. Victor immediately responded. The Count's estate required urgent handling. His explanation arrived quickly again. Too quickly. Owen noticed the same reaction spreading across the faces around the table. The attorney seemed to have an answer for every question before the question fully existed. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The watchman looked through the glass wall toward the executive corridor. Beyond. For 18 years, he had watched people move through this building. He had seen ambitious young associates become partners. He had seen fortunes rise and fall. He had learned something simple. Honest people usually welcomed questions. Dishonest people rushed toward answers. The chief executive walked slowly back toward the authorization form. His reflection moved across the polished table like a shadow. "I want the original estate file," he said. "Everything." The compliance officer immediately nodded. Within minutes, secure digital archives began loading onto the conference room display. Hundreds of pages appeared. Estate correspondence, trustee notes, legal filings, medical certifications. The room studied them in silence. Then Owen noticed something unusual. A letter dated 6 months earlier appeared on the screen. It contained instructions from the Count regarding charitable donations scheduled after his passing. The signature was unmistakable. The familiar loop remained exactly where it had always been. So did the full written date. More importantly, the letter contained a statement that caused several executives to lean forward simultaneously. The Count had specifically ordered that no transfer exceeding $10 million be executed without independent review by 2 trustees. Yet the authorization sitting on the table involved $100 million and only one approval pathway. The chief executive looked up slowly. His eyes moved from the screen to Victor Hale. Why would the Count create safeguards against large transfers and then authorized this? Nobody answered. Victor opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time all afternoon, he appeared to be searching for words. And in that moment, Owen Whitmore realized something extraordinary. The room no longer needed him to prove the document was false. The document was beginning to expose itself. The realization settled over the conference room slowly, like snow covering a landscape one quiet layer at a time. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. The evidence had grown too large to ignore. What had begun as a routine authorization now looked increasingly like a carefully constructed illusion. The chief executive remained standing beside the display screen, studying the estate records with growing concern. Around him, board members reviewed documents that only hours earlier they would have approved without hesitation. Every page seemed to raise another question. Every answer appeared to point in the same direction. Owen Whitmore stood quietly near the end of the table. For the first time since speaking up, he said nothing. He did not need to. The documents were speaking for him now. The compliance officer continued navigating the archive. Then she paused. I found something. The room immediately focused on the screen. A series of security records appeared. Not financial records. Not legal records. Building access records. The chief executive frowned. Why are we looking at security logs? Because the estate file references a private meeting between the Count and his trustees 6 months before his death, she replied. I wanted to verify who attended. Names appeared on the screen one by one. The Count, 2 trustees, a physician, estate advisors. The list matched the meeting summary almost perfectly. Almost. One name appeared repeatedly in the access records, but was absent from the official notes. Victor Hale. The room grew silent again. The attorney's face remained composed, but his eyes narrowed slightly. I was legal counsel, he said. My presence is hardly suspicious. Nobody argued. Yet nobody looked convinced either. The compliance officer continued scrolling. More records appeared. Additional meetings. Additional visits. Again and again, Victor's access card appeared in places where official summaries never mentioned him. Private estate consultations. Asset reviews. Document preparation sessions. Each omission seemed minor by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. The chief executive folded his arms. Why would your attendance be omitted from the records? Victor opened his mouth to answer. Before he could, another voice interrupted. One of the board members had been quietly reviewing the trustee correspondence. Because according to these letters, the Count was becoming concerned about outside influence. Every eye turned toward him. He adjusted his glasses and continued reading. The Count instructed trustees to limit discussions regarding estate distribution to documented sessions only. A heavy silence followed. The meaning was obvious. The Count had wanted transparency. Yet somehow critical decisions appeared connected to conversations that left little trace behind. Owen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. Then the compliance officer enlarged one final document. It was a memorandum written by the Count less than a year before his passing. Most of it contained routine estate instructions. But near the bottom sat a single sentence highlighted by age and importance. The Count had written, if any future transfer appears inconsistent with my established wishes, trust the records, not the messenger. The room stared at the words. Nobody spoke. Because for the first time all afternoon, the question was no longer whether the authorization was genuine. The question had become how far the deception reached. The sentence remained on the screen like a voice reaching across time. Trust the records, not the messenger. Nobody in the conference room seemed eager to speak after reading it. Outside, evening shadows had begun creeping across the snowy rooftops of Zurich, turning the city silver and blue beneath the winter sky. Inside the bank, however, the atmosphere had become almost electric. The chief executive stared at the memorandum for several long moments before looking toward Victor Hale. The attorney stood perfectly still. His expensive suit remained immaculate. His posture remained confident. Yet something had changed. The effortless certainty he carried at the beginning of the meeting was gone. In its place sat calculation. The compliance officer continued reviewing the estate archive. Then another file appeared. I found correspondence between the trustees, she said quietly. A series of messages filled the screen. Most concerned routine estate matters. One message, however, immediately captured everyone's attention. It had been sent 3 months before the Count's passing. One trustee expressed concern regarding repeated requests to accelerate certain transfers. Another responded that the count had specifically instructed them to move slowly and document every major decision. The chief executive frowned. Who was requesting acceleration? The compliance officer clicked open the attachment. The answer appeared instantly. Victor Hale. No one reacted immediately. The room had moved beyond surprise. Each new discovery simply confirmed what everyone was already beginning to suspect. More correspondence followed. Additional requests. Additional pressure. Repeated attempts to bypass normal review procedures. None of it proved the authorization had been fabricated. Yet together the messages painted a troubling picture. Owen Whitmore watched silently from the far end of the room. He felt no satisfaction, only sadness. Count Alexander Beaumont had spent decades building a reputation based on trust. He had treated employees with dignity. He had protected charitable foundations. He had believed that wealth carried responsibility. Now the final chapter of his legacy was being examined through a cloud of doubt created by someone entrusted to protect it. The compliance officer opened one final folder. This arrived yesterday, she said. It was automatically archived because nobody considered it relevant. A handwritten letter appeared on the screen. Unlike the transfer authorization, this document had been verified months earlier through multiple channels. It contained instructions from the count regarding the future distribution of his estate. The familiar loop appeared in the signature. The full date appeared exactly as expected, but it was the final paragraph that transformed the room. The count wrote that any extraordinary transfer requested after his death should be delayed until all trustees reached unanimous agreement. No exceptions, no emergency provisions, no accelerated authority. The chief executive slowly closed his eyes. The authorization sitting on the table violated every safeguard the count had carefully established. When he opened his eyes again, he no longer looked uncertain. He looked resolved. Suspend the transfer permanently, he said. Open a full investigation. Effective immediately. For the first time all afternoon, nobody objected. Not even Victor Hale. The investigation moved quickly after that. In institutions built on precision, once doubt entered the system, every detail was examined. Within days, independent auditors arrived. Estate records were reviewed. Archive communications were compared. Security logs were analyzed. What began as a question surrounding a single authorization gradually revealed a much larger pattern. Several documents connected to the estate contained inconsistencies that had previously escaped notice because nobody had thought to question them. Tiny discrepancies appeared in timelines. Approval sequences failed to match established procedures. Certain records referenced meetings that could not be fully verified. None of those discoveries would have existed without the moment a watchman chose to speak. Meanwhile, the snow that had blanketed Zurich on the afternoon of the meeting slowly melted into the rivers and stone streets below. Winter gave way to early spring. The bank returned to its normal rhythm. Clients arrived. Fortunes moved. Meetings continued. Yet one thing had changed. People no longer walked past Owen Whitmore without seeing him. The executives who once barely noticed him now greeted him by name. Some stopped to shake his hand. Others simply nodded with a respect that had not existed before. Owen accepted the attention politely, though it always made him slightly uncomfortable. He had never wanted recognition. He had only wanted to prevent a mistake. One morning, several weeks after the investigation began, the chief executive asked Owen to join him in a private office overlooking the river. The room was elegant but understated. Sunlight reflected off the water below, filling the space with a warm silver glow. On the desk sat a small wooden box. The chief executive opened it carefully. Inside rested an old fountain pen, the same pen Count Alexander Beaumont had used for many years. This was found among the personal items designated for the bank archive, the chief executive said. The trustees felt there was someone else who should have it. Owen stared at the pen in silence. It looked ordinary, yet he understood what it represented. Not wealth, not status, trust. The chief executive smiled gently. The count spent his life believing that character mattered more than titles. I think he would have appreciated what happened. For a moment, neither man spoke. Beyond the window, boats moved slowly across the river. Church bells echoed faintly from distant streets. The city carried on exactly as it always had. Yet Owen felt something settle inside him. A quiet sense of peace. The estate itself was ultimately protected according to the Count's original wishes. Charitable foundations received their intended support. Trustees completed their responsibilities under increased oversight. The transfer that had nearly slipped through was never executed. More importantly, the principles the Count valued most remained intact. In the months that followed, a new training program was introduced throughout the bank. Employees at every level were encouraged to raise concerns regardless of rank or position. The lesson was simple. Good judgment did not belong exclusively to people with impressive titles. Sometimes the person closest to the truth was the one everyone overlooked. Nearly a year later, the story had become part of the bank's culture. New employees heard it during training. Senior executives referenced it during meetings. Not because of the money that had been protected, although $100 million was certainly unforgettable, and not because of the investigation that followed, although its impact reshaped procedures throughout the institution. The story endured because it reminded people of something easy to forget in places built on wealth and influence. The truth does not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. Sometimes it stands quietly by a doorway. One crisp autumn morning, Owen Whitmore arrived for work as he always had. The air carried the scent of rain from the nearby river. Golden leaves drifted across the stone sidewalks of Zurich. The city moved at its usual pace, elegant and unhurried. Owen stepped through the bank's front entrance and nodded politely to the reception staff. In many ways, nothing had changed. He still arrived early. He still greeted visitors. He still preferred listening over speaking. Yet in one important way, everything was different. People saw him now, not because he had become famous, not because he had gained authority. They saw him because they finally understood his value. Later that afternoon, a small ceremony took place inside a private conference room overlooking the river. There were no reporters, no cameras, no grand speeches. Only a handful of employees, trustees, and executives gathered together. At the center of the room stood a framed letter recently discovered among the Count's personal papers. It contained a final reflection written only months before his passing. The words were simple. The Count wrote that institutions survive not because of rules alone, but because ordinary people choose to honor them. He wrote that integrity often hides in humble places. And he wrote that the strongest guardians of any legacy are those who expect nothing in return for protecting it. When the letter was finished, the room remained silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, a grateful one. Owen looked through the windows toward the river shimmering beneath the afternoon sun. He thought about Walter Finch, the old mail handler whose attention to detail had quietly echoed across the years. He thought about the Count and the tiny loop that represented love, memory, and consistency. He thought about how close an entire fortune had come to disappearing because everyone assumed someone else had already checked. Then he smiled. Not because he had stopped a transfer, not because he had earned recognition, but because the right thing had happened. In the end, that was enough. The river continued flowing. The seasons continued changing. Life moved forward as it always does. Yet one lesson remained behind, enduring long after the documents were archived and the meetings were forgotten. True worth is not measured by titles, wealth, or status. It is measured by character. And sometimes the people standing closest to the truth are the very ones the world overlooks. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving the video a like, and sharing it with someone who believes integrity still matters. Thank you for being part of this journey, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.